This video was originally going to just be about the Netflix documentary Disclosure. It got away from me. But that's okay, because this is my show and I do what I want. Disclosure is a documentary about the depictions of trans people in popular media that dropped on Netflix while I was in the middle of making a video on the same topic. Thanks a lot, guys. It covers a lot of the same territory that I cover in that video, albeit far deeper than I ever could, and with a lot more talking heads. It also takes race into account much more, which as a white person, I don't exactly feel very comfortable calling myself any kind of authority on. It does have a very good section on the importance of boys don't cry in the popular trans narrative. I'm still undecided on whether I was too nice to that movie, but it's good to hear trans masculine voices talking about it. Again, something I prioritize is hearing the voices of those affected by something above my own droning. This time, I'm going to ground this video in something that I am 100% comfortable calling myself an authority on, which is to say the topic of gender nonconforming trans women and trans feminine non-binary people. Here's the issue. When I was watching Disclosure, I found it really great as far as looking at trans representation and hearing trans voices from gender-conforming trans women. Even the face of the film, Laverne Cox in all her majesty, looking absolutely regal. I missed something. While I enjoyed Disclosure and would highly recommend watching it, especially since it's on Netflix, there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind the entire time, and it was probably the same nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I had before I transitioned. Is that what trans women are supposed to look like? I don't look like that. I don't even want to look like that. Does that make me not trans? In this video, I don't just want to talk about Disclosure. I want to use Disclosure as a jumping off point to talk about the broader cultural issues regarding gender nonconforming trans women and the discussion that is being had, or rather, not being had, about this topic. A lot of people who might not necessarily be transgender may play with gender in ways that are similar to people who transgress gendered boundaries. In fact, originally that's where transgender came from as a word, as transgressively gendered. In the very broadest sense, people who go against gendered boundaries but don't transition per se are still labeled as cis, despite the fact that identities can become more and more complicated the more outside of what's traditionally accepted someone gets. However, when the topic of explicitly transgender people comes up, a lot of the cultural consciousness is very narrow in their views. When you think about a transgender woman, you might immediately think of Laverne Cox, to use a relevant example. But there seems to be an even narrower view of what is acceptable womanhood for transgender women. In fact, our culture has room for these kinds of in-between identities. In lesbian culture, butch lesbians are common and a known stereotype. It's one that crosses over with the trans-masculine community, and the line between the two is pretty blurry. But again, in trans discourse, the popular consciousness finds it harder and harder to conceive of trans people who might transgress those gendered boundaries even further. People who don't fit what trans people are explicitly supposed to look like. Trans women who don't look like Laverne Cox, for example. In her video essay, How to Pass as a Woman, Mia Mulder discusses a very unusual problem. She talks at length about how the further on she gets in her transition, she finds it harder to pass and she finds that she's getting misgendered more and more often. But she concludes that what's changing isn't that she's looking less female. What she finds is that what's changing is the cultural awareness of trans people, and that the culture is redefining what trans women look like. A trans woman to our culture no longer looks like an angry man yelling at a GameStop employee to call her ma'am. The culture is now thinking of trans women who look more like Laverne Cox, or like Mia Mulder, or like Natalie Wynn. Oh, we'll get to you, Miss Wynn. Don't you worry your pretty little head about that. I'm going to call this phenomenon the Mulder paradox, where trans people are less likely to pass not because they don't present their gender or aren't passable, but because society's conception of what a trans person looks like has changed. Disclosure does a good job talking about the way that trans women went from being just predatory men in dresses to being seen as women. However, to an extent, it also reinforces the Mulder paradox, because it's aimed at a cis audience, and this is reinforcing the cultural conception of what trans women look like. I have what I think is a unique perspective on the Mulder paradox, because I don't think it affects me as badly. I'm a fairly butch-presenting trans woman. There's a reason my avatar wears a blazer and not a dress. There's a reason my closet is full of flannel shirts, denim jackets, and combat boots. I'm basically tabby. Because of that, and because the estrogen has been good to me, I don't think I share the same problem that Mia Mulder is running into. I think I've avoided the Mulder paradox because popular culture can't conceive of a trans woman who doesn't fit the stereotype for what we look like, even further reinforced by documentaries like Disclosure. Whether or not I pass is fairly binary. My odds of passing early in transition were a lot lower, because I didn't look at all feminine. But right now, if I'm wearing a push-up bra and my hair down, I will most likely pass as a woman, which, if you believe the discourse around trans women, is hard to believe for some. And yeah, we finally get to talk about you, Miss Points. I know how much you love the attention. So I've dragged Natalie a lot in this video, but I actually love her content, and without her, I wouldn't have been inspired to make these videos. The aesthetic is one of the most discussed ContraPoints videos, partially because it's almost always called in as evidence every time someone wants to drag Natalie for being true scum, which she's not. And whenever someone wants to shit on her for being anti-non-binary, which she's not. I think a lot of the hot takes about the aesthetic are pretty far off the mark because she doesn't mention non-binary people at all in the video. The video is fairly squarely talking about non-passing and gender non-conforming trans women, and especially angst directed inward at Natalie herself. In fact, Justine in this video is a manifestation of every negative thought Natalie has ever had about herself and about trans women in the public eye. And she argues that performing womanhood is the way forward for advancing trans discourse, which Natalie shows is misguided, as evidenced by the end of the video depicting transphobes of all stripes and having Justine and Tabby agree to stop fighting. People who agree with Justine's perspective would say that I am failing at doing womanhood. I consider myself non-binary, yeah, not exactly female, but I present as a woman, but my voice in these videos just screams male, so I'm not performing womanhood in a way that's expected of me by the YouTube audience. Where I really think the aesthetic falls short is that it takes as read the idea that gender non-conforming trans women cannot be taken seriously in public discourse. Contrast the aesthetic with her earlier video, Tiffany Tumbles. Another dialogue where a stand-in for Blair White argues with a stand-in for radical trans YouTube in Adria Finley. This video gets her point across much better, in my opinion, because not only does Adria win the argument and convince Jackie Jackson to her side, she walks away with no self-hatred, whereas Tiffany goes home and has to drown her sorrows in vodka. Adria herself is portrayed as masculine presenting trans lesbian, a point that Tiffany Tumbles is very eager to point out. What all this means is that I think Natalie understands what gender non-conforming trans women go through. But the failing of Natalie doing videos brushing up against this topic is that I can't take her words too seriously because she is the textbook definition of a gender conforming cis woman. I think genuinely the problem I'm running into with this kind of erasure of non-passing and gender non-conforming trans women is just what I said earlier, that most people take it as a given that trans women are meant to be totally gender conforming, that you're not allowed to transition into, say, Kristen Stewart. Part of the issue is also the kind of casual eraser about the discourse. No one would tell you that you can't transition into a butch woman. The problem is that society seems dismissive of the idea of non-conforming trans women. People will look at you funny if you're a trans woman and you say you got more out of Stone Butch Blues than out of Redefining Realness, which I did. Laura Jane Grace is the only trans woman I can think of who is really out there living as a badass punk chick, and her autobiography was really formative for me in learning where I wanted to go with all this gender nonsense. When I was first growing up, I felt like I could never transition because I was always admiring butch biker chicks, and I grew up with a trans narrative that said all trans women had to be perfect 50s housewives or else not transition at all. And it sucks that YouTube is perpetuating this idea with endless cavalcades of trans beauty queens, and especially with the political voice of trans women on YouTube being basically two of the same flavor. Blair White might rage against non-binary people and transgenders, but what she's also preaching is a very gender conformist and cis-normative view of what trans people even look like. There are gender non-conforming binary trans women who medically transition and get all the surgeries, and I would bet you anything that Blair White would still demean them because they don't look the part. But at the end of the day, what even is looking the part? What's the point of even allowing people to transition if you're going to force them into these boxes? Because as a wise Glitterbeard once said, purchasing acceptance through conformity is not freedom. It's just adding another cell to the prison.